Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Aaron Glass. I'm a faculty member here at Bard Graduate Center. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to join me in acknowledging our presence here tonight in Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape, and along a crossroads of many Indigenous peoples from this region and indeed the globe. I would like to welcome both our regulars and our first-time guests, as well as those watching online, to this first installment in our annual seminar series called the Indigenous Arts in Transition. Somewhat self-indulgently, I've programmed this year's seminar series around the Indigenous arts from the North Pacific Coast, which tonight's talk will be a participant in, and this will be a kind of preview for the launch of our spring focus exhibition, which I'm curating with my current and former students, which is called The Story Box, which is about Franz Boas, George Hunt, and Kwakwaka'wakw culture. And we'll have more programming in the spring related to the exhibition. The second speaker in the series will be Charlotte Townsend Galt, speaking on contemporary Indigenous art from the coast in April. And we'll have other public programming around that as well. The exhibit opens on February 13th. For those joining us remotely, please feel free to participate in the Q&A afterwards by tweeting questions to #BardGradCenterTV. Without further ado, I am very thrilled to introduce our speaker tonight, Jisgang Nika Collison, who is the executive director and curator of the Haida Gwaii Museum at Llnagaay, off the northern coast of British Columbia, and a distinguished Indigenous fellow at the University of British Columbia's Green College in Vancouver, which is in the southwest of the Northwest Coast. For 2 decades, Collison has paved the way in renegotiating terms of relationship between Native peoples and museums worldwide, and in repatriating Haida treasures and ancestors to Haida Gwaii. Last year, in recognition for this important work, she received the 2017 Michael Ames Award for Innovation from the Council for Museum Anthropology. I was thrilled and surprised to be at the reception at which she was given the award, and was named a Changemaker, one of British Columbia's top 10 cultural professionals by the BC Museums Association. Collison is a frequent educator and consultant, a song leader and choreographer, and a fixture on advisory boards of numerous Canadian and international organizations, including the Vancouver Opera, the National Gallery of Canada, and the American Museum of Natural History, right here in our own backyard. She has curated or contributed to countless exhibitions, written for many catalogs and volumes on Haida culture and Northwest Coast art, and edited or co-edited 3 books. That Which Makes Us Haida, The Haida Language, in 2011, Came to Tell Something, Art and Artist in Haida Society, in 2014, and Athli Gwaii, Upholding Haida Law at Lyle Island, 2018. And I have an assortment of some of these books at the end of the table if you'd like to look at them after the talk. Now the moment you've probably all secretly been waiting for, as I try to pronounce the Haida in her talk. And in fact, we were just joking, a mutual friend of ours who's Tsimshian from the coast always ribs me because I pronounce her Smalgiach language with a Kwakwala accent. So we'll see how I do with the Haida. Collison will be presenting Gina Suuda Tl'l Xasii, Came to Tell Something, documenting convergence, divergence, and coexistence through Haida art and narrative. Please join me in welcoming Nika Collison.
Hawa, can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. Hawa, Aaron, and if my face is a little red, it's because of your kind words. Hawa, very much. Haida gatla sis dalang wad luchan gathul kiltla, Jisgang hanudik iagaga. Nika Collison hanudik iagaga yets haidaga. Yets haida kithki. Sa flindanai di skangul haga. Lenny Lenape, Hawa, Dr. Aaron Glass, Hawa, Bard Graduate Center, Hawa, at Dalang Wad Luhan Skaudagi Gathul Kiltla. This lecture is based on a slightly adapted excerpt from an article entitled Gut Gianagung, Look at One Another, co-written by Dr. Catherine Bunn-Marcuse and myself, to be published in the academic journal Aboriginal, Journal of Indigenous Studies in First Nations and First Peoples Cultures, in a special themed issue on the topic of the entangled gaze, Indigenous and European views of the other, edited by Dr. Gerald McMaster. The journal is a follow-up to Gerald's conference of the same name, which was held in the fall of 2017 at OCAD University in Toronto. There, participants were directed to consider how artists represent who are different from themselves. How do I use this? Do I just press? No. Uh-oh. Ah, there we go. Okay. So, how artists represent people who are different from ourselves and what consequences arise from these representations. Katie and I chose to present together, bringing forth our respective practices of Western and nation-based scholarship to present artworks and cultural creations as a form of history making, reflecting Indigenous artists' experience of looking at one another. I would like to give a shout out to Katie for our friendship and the work we get to do together. On the northwest coast of America, artwork has always documented identity, relationships with each other, the earth, and the supernatural, and histories held by individuals, clans, and or nations, and they span back to the time of before human occupation on earth. Artists use local and introduced materials, and they embrace new mediums to represent how we make some sense of the world. These artworks reflect complicated relationships that Indigenous artists navigated with Euro-Americans during a period when communities were grappling with fundamental changes in social practices and cultural expressions. Interactions with Indigenous peoples have long been documented by Euro-Americans using written narratives and imagery fabricated from and for colonial purpose. Not so much now. These imaginings dominate and soften the popular understanding of history. By privileging Indigenous records of interactions with Euro-Americans through art and oral narratives and correcting written records, in this case that of those on us, history is not challenged nor changed, it is revealed. So here's my half of the article. When asked, how do we represent people who are different from ourselves, we first have to consider the self, as you can't have the other without having a self. In looking at each other through our respective lenses, we should consider cultural perspectives about concepts like abstraction and how these terms are applied to the artworks. Haida art is the visual companion to Haida Kill, the Haida language. Art and language are the fundamental forms of Haida communication and the vehicles for Haida history. Serving both social and economic functions, art also demonstrates the importance our nation puts on high aesthetics. In order to read Haida art, the viewer must know the story behind it. It is a form of writing that communicates, among other things, lineage and identity, relationships with each other, the earth and the supernatural, rank and status, and histories held by individuals, clans, or collectively by our nation, from those spanning back to the time of the supernatural through to today. Today, as in the past, artists not only use materials gathered from Haida Gwaii or traded from the mainland with Indigenous nations, they also embrace new mediums as well as technologies and practices to represent how we look at, document, and make some sense out of the world, ourselves, and the others we share it with. Lineages, histories, and prerogatives can be found on or within almost all of our historic belongings and much of our modern day ones. But presenting identity, history, and social stature transcends material culture. Examples of this include the act of setting identity into our skin via tattoos, or painting who we are onto our faces, piercing rights through our flesh, and binding assertions to our hair and limbs, assertions meaning declarations of identity, history, and social stature, along with rights and privileges to properties. Names, songs, stories, the rights one has to wear certain things in certain ways, and other acts even more intimate, such as movement and speech, all communicate who we are. As one grows one's history, reflecting on it and responding to changes in oneself, society, and the greater world, these articulations of self can also change. The first tree on Haida Gwaii, a jath or pine tree, appeared on Llnagaay, also known as the Bokas Islands. Two clans claim this tree as their prerogative, the Hagilanis and Skolatis. A depiction of this tree was put into the arm of a Skolatis woman in the late 1800s by John Cross, my great-great-grandfather, grandfather to many, who was a designer, carver, and tattoo artist. This image is a crayon rendition of the original tattoo, which my grandfather drew for early ethnographer John R. Swanton. The tattoo not only speaks to the first tree to occur after the last ice age, approximately 12,500 years before present, it speaks to the rank and status of the Skolatis clan, who not only maintained a reputation fit enough to carry such a high crest over generations, but to add additional preciousness to this. Now, this is balanced out by science. When they started listening to our oral histories, they found that indeed the first tree to grow on Haida Gwaii after the Ice Age was the pine tree, which is how we know of the era in when it appeared. The tattoo reflects both ancient connections to our land and materials introduced through Indigenous and Euro-American trade practices. I interpret the square shapes, I interpret the square shapes of property hanging from the tree's branches as earrings made from the beloved abalone shell obtained through trade with the indigenous peoples from California. Cross identified the large swaths of fabric on either side of the tree, meaning those sort of big dark lines, as European trade cloth. And I would suggest that many, if not all, of the necklaces hanging from the branches, as you see on the lower ones, are made from European trade beads, commodities highly valued by our ancestors. But before long, we discovered Europeans wandering on our waters. A spaga or shaman had a supernatural being speak through him, relaying the prophecy of newcomers that would come and what would follow. Opportunity, but also devastation. In the 1860s, our population plummeted from introduced disease and withheld vaccinations. A population upwards of 30,000 was decimated to less than 600 on Haida Gwaii by the turn of the century. Survivors on our island came together from across Haida Gwaii, moving into two main villages, Skidegit and Old Masset. Two fires remain, just as the spaga was told. The survivors of this biological genocide went on to face a cultural genocide facilitated through Canada's Indian Act and the residential school system. Hereditary leader in Dansu, James Hart, whose great-grandfather was Charles Edenshaw, explains the strength it took to carry on, stating, "It's stunning how the survivors found ways to live in two worlds and to continue documenting the world around us and within us. We united to survive. They had to be tough and hold it together to get somewhere. They had kids and raised their family. They instilled the Haida way in their family. And they survived the switch from Haida way to white man way, carrying Haida along with it." Before colonial assaults on cultural practices increased in the 19th century and 20th centuries, relationships with Europeans were mainly economy-based, focused on trade, though not without conflict. Expansive and highly complex economies existed up and down the coast, into the interior and beyond, long before Europeans found their way here. Before trade with Euro-Americans, we predominantly imported raw materials and exported manufactured goods. It is no surprise that early explorers found our ancestors, including women, to be highly experienced traders. The first Western accepted documentation of contact between Haida and foreigners occurred in July of 1774. Spanish sailors aboard the SV Santiago traded with our ancestors, commenting in their journals on our relatives' exceptional trading skills and our art. Following this encounter, hundreds of ships entered our waters to do business. Small villages throughout Haida Gwaii began to consolidate, forming large mercantile villages in order to better participate in this new economy, which greatly increased our gross national product. Above all, yachts, iron, was the commodity our ancestors prized most, while Europeans sought our rich, finely worked naki, or sea otter fur. Other trade items desired by Europeans included personal belongings such as fine weaving, intricate carvings, and local foods. These and other goods were exchanged for wares such as muskets, iron pots, brass buttons, and cloth. Eventually, our ancestors accepted silver and gold coins, first to fashion into jewelry and later to enter into the cash economy. Western scholars have dated commercial carvings of argillite, a carbonaceous shale unique to Haida Gwaii, back to the 1820s or 30s, starting with small and then later larger ornate pipes carved in classical Haida form, soon followed by the emergence of ship panel pipes, essentially moving from a Haida worldview into a Haida worldview that was greatly entangled, just like we live today. In using the term classical, orthodox, customary, and traditional, I aim to delineate our formline art that our people developed and have maintained over thousands of years as distinct from representational forms that became more popular post-contact. Made for sale, works depicting various Haida realms in traditional form were enjoyed and collected by sailors and others, but not so much by anthropologists. Effectively, our ancestors created a tourist trade by turning argillite and other materials into what is often called curios. In the first half of the 19th century, the sea otter population was hunted to near extinction. With the waning of this fur economy, savvy artists diversified their markets by adding a stylized realism and other new forms inspired by exposure to European people and culture into their classical repertoire. Whether executed in traditional or representative format, the emergence of Haida curio art was unusual in that it was created simply for economic purpose, absent of a presiding social function, and yet it was still documenting history. As exposure to European lifeways grew, our art continued to change. Ranging in materials from argillite to wood, metal, ivory, and more, models of European sailing ships became even more ornate. These works are exhilarating documentation of earlier interactions, while at the same time a reminder of colonial impacts. Masterful works depicting European sailing ships, sea captains, missionaries, merchants, and other imagery taken from interactions with Europeans were not only integral to our economy, but to the survival of our own way of life as social art, as our social function art became outlawed. Whether created in an orthodox or stylized manner, or a combination of both, these new products were meant to keep both our customers and oppressors happy, and to maintain control over ourselves. Whether looking at traveling aboard European ships or our people documented many of their observations through highly stylized interpretations. The incorporation of wondrous plants, animals, and other beings, including some belonging to Haida Gwaii, provide clues about who was aboard and where they traveled. So these carved records of our encounters, as I mentioned, were not only limited to ship panels. There are many instances of foreign beings depicted in sculpture, such as masks, model figures, and all sorts of other things of the other. An oval-shaped argillite plate in the Haida Gwaii Museum is an example of our ancestors fancying European motifs. This platter features an American eagle complete with olives and arrows. Circling the eagle are backwards numbers reading 8481, encompassed on either side by the name Barnett, also backwards, separated by the letter I. One theory, suggested by Natalie McFarlane, is the artist might have copied the text from the back side of a ship's door window, so it would be inverted. Well, the manufacture of argillite plates is thought to have begun in the 1840s, given the quality of earlier argillite carvings and the knowledge that a Captain Barnett of the trading ship Gustavus III traded with our people in 1791. It is fair to wonder if the plate might not have been made a little bit earlier. Whether created for societal use, economic use, aesthetic exploration, or navigating colonialism, Haida art tells a story. The social art of our nation was developed over millennia, taught to us by the supernatural and informed by our environment over the ages. It is largely objective, a visual regulatory of an inspirational nature, reminding us, Haida, who we are and how we fit into the world. In order to properly read the art, as I said before, we must come well versed in its context. The coming of Europeans brought great upheaval and precipitous change to our people and environment. Our ancestors' ability to adapt to both opportunity and oppression while not losing sight of who we are is why we are still here. This win is not only reflected by the enduring presence of our societal or commercial works in today's world, it is powerfully documented in our ancestors' curio art. Developed over just a few decades rather than thousands of years, Haida curio art, I'm not saying I like the word curio art, was our visual response to the tumultuous change brought on by capitalism and colonialism. Because of the art's rapid formation, its departure from societal norms, and its documentation of two very foreign worlds colliding, reading it is largely subjective. So for far too long, history has been told by the other. Bringing Indigenous ethos, scholarship, and sensibility together with Western academia is essential to understanding the shared history of Indigenous peoples and the settler nations of Canada and the United States, because, like Haida societal art, you cannot properly read curio art without being well versed in its context. And if we don't have context, meaning stories, how do we know who we are and how we fit into this world? Something I've said a few times already. You can't have the other without having a self. In this, it is important to look at how our ancestors' self-reflections are captured post-contact, leading to a further entanglement. What I've observed in looking at these new forms of art reflects what Chief Dunsu said about our people surviving, not by becoming white, but by adapting colonial life into a Haida worldview, ensuring our Haidaness stayed firmly within and around us. There are many works that exemplify our maintaining control of our Haida identity while acknowledging the changes around us. A female ancestress in the collection of the University of Aberdeen is one of my favorite examples of a person caught between two worlds. Believed to be created in the mid-19th century, and by the way, if any of my slides say mid-18th century, they're supposed to say mid-19th century. Forgot to check. Anyways, believed to be created in the mid-19th century, this sculpture departs from classical Haida form. And while she is devoid of a labrette, which is often how you can tell it's a woman in a classical carving, she wears face paint rights upon her face. While she dons a headscarf and European clothing, she also wears a button blanket over top. The robe, made from European cloth, illustrates our turning a new world into a Haida one. Trade cloth was a highly valued commodity. Already made, this soft new textile provided warmth, comfort, and a new medium for aesthetic production and high fashion. Trade blankets and buttons were quickly utilized to make a new style, including tunics, dance aprons, and leggings and robes, in which those pieces helped to outline the crests that were being worn. And they usually were appliqued over top of the trade cloth. They were and are often trimmed with precious indigenous trade materials such as California abalone shell or dentalia shell, or European trade materials such as pearl buttons, which, like abalone shell, catch the light of the fire. So while this woman wears European cloth, it has been worked into a Haida world. If you see women in a potlatch today, you might see a similar look. Western clothing under crest wear and rights. Obviously, it's timeless. Documenting a period of artistic dynamism, a painted wooden sculpture carving in the Museum of Vancouver represents a spaga, or spiritual and medicinal practitioner. Visually, it represents a traditional rather than a transitional image, but the artist's application is both classical and imitative in form. By carving in a naturalistic style, the artist had freedom to work both within and outside the rather strict conventions of a classical Haida sculptural form. When reading this figure, we first see the spaga as female, not because of her breasts, which actually breaks from more traditional ways of depicting woman, but because of her libret. And the size of this libret documents that she is a highly accomplished and respected older woman. The woman's hat, the circular healing rattles in her hands, and her apron tells us she is a doctor. Her face is carved as if it would be presented on a mask or a monumental pole, but it's turned slightly. The doctor's apron is styled to represent painted leather with fringes embellished with puffin beaks or the hooves of game. I'd venture her carved cape represents the leather practitioner ones found in museums. The figure wears a hat representing bear ears, which in real life would have been made from the skin of the animal or depicted through nachin or chilkat weaving. Works created for social function are shaped by both their intended use and the boundaries of their associated canvas, resulting in medium-based dialects of Haida formline arts, meaning how formline is modified to work effectively within flat design, sculpture, weaving, and tattoos. In the case of a totem pole or a monumental pole, beings are fit into the tree they are carved from, save for added features such as protruding beaks and the like, and they are often depicted as crouching, these figures, or by repositioning elements within themselves or amongst each other. If this spaga were represented on a monumental pole, her body would typically be executed in pole dialect, with a contained formal posture, most likely crouching, her face in the same form, still holding the rattles, sporting her hat, and possibly her apron, as can be seen on this Haida pole held in the British Museum. The skaga is right at the top. You can see she's holding the round rattles. That is also a female. So while the skaga's body in the model still holds the tension that is known in our art, it loosens slightly and stretches upwards into an informal composition roused in part, at least, by European interests and cultural stimuli. We as contemporary Haida look at how our ancestors looked at themselves. In discussing the form of this shaman figure with Haida scholar Walker Brown, and considering aesthetic decisions in pole carving in comparison to model carving, Brown suggests the elongated feature is not as big of a departure from classical form as I imply. He sees this type of skaga carving as a modern, transportable version of skaga grave protector figures, which indeed are carved standing up. So a seemingly unique viewpoint such as this again underlines just how crucial Indigenous knowledge and worldviews are in contemporary explorations and understandings of Indigenous art history. While the 1800s saw social function art gain the company of curio art, with much of the curio art exhibiting experimentation with different forms of realism and abstraction, it's worth complicating these categories. When Haida artists adopted realism or a naturalistic approach to carving Euro-American inspired motifs, it was a departure for them from the customary style of Haida aesthetics that had been in place for generations. Would this new realism have seemed an abstraction to them? Imagine our ancestors experienced something as theoretical as an excess of curvilinear lines that don't follow the rules, or the incredible abstraction of representation through representing life in a realistic form rather than a holistic visual language, and learning of such fantastical creatures, both human and other beings. On the flip side, there is an ancient story that must date back between 5,000 to 6,000 years of a chief, a Haida chief, who lost his young wife that he loved very much. He could not stop his deep grieving. He could not let her go. A man in the village offered to carve a likeness of her face, a mask that would look exactly like her. When he brought it to the chief could not believe his eyes and put it on his wife's body. It was so alive, it looked just as she did. He could not believe she was not alive, and neither could others who saw her. So we'll fast forward the story for the sake of our time here. The chiefs and villagers eventually erected her above a small cedar tree, and the tree grew up around her, and they say that is why our cedar trees are of such high quality today. As well, I've been told that death masks were carved in a person's likeness without European influence as well, a little later in the history. And additionally, some early argillite carvings asserted in the Western world to have been the earliest of commercial trade with Europeans are actually cockle shells carved in realistic form. And some of us say that actually predates the commercial economy, amulets or what they might have been. Regardless, our world certainly opened up, just as earlier interactions with Asians and Polynesians must have influenced our people, and vice versa, just as the European world would have developed further when we introduced ourselves. The Haida representation of self existed thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans, but a Haida headdress frontlet here demonstrates inspiration taken from the abstract, realistic aesthetic used in items made for sale and then incorporated into works representing status and rank within our own world. Suuda was my great-great-grandmother. Her likeness is on the front of the headdress that was made for her as a very young girl. Many thanks to Heather Pringle of the Llnagaay Institute for bringing the photo and the headdress together. Well, I suggest that approaches to realism might be found without the influence of European contact to present a realistic portrait on a headdress rather than figures depicting powerful beings associated with its wearer is not known in earlier times based on the research of Dr. Robin Wright. A strategic combination of styles also comes together in a wooden grave marker shaped and painted to resemble a granite tombstone. Having recently found a home in the Gwaii Museum after being safe-kept in a private home for decades, the marker is inscribed with the words, "In the memory of," and we'll remove the name, who died November 24th, 1880, aged 38 years. The lower inscription reads, "Blessed are dead which die in the Lord." Between the wording protrudes a sculpted figure in a flowing dress, probably a woman and probably pregnant. Angel-like wings extend from either side of her body while her right hand points upwards, presumably to heaven. If the marker date is accurate, the deceased died just 3 years after Reverend W.H. Collison held the first evangelical meeting in Skidegate, where the marker is said to be from. I am content in asserting the grave marker is Haida-made, and I would read the figure on the marker as a European. However, it is possible the deceased family may have chosen or may have been required to use Christian iconography, given the authority of the church over our ancestors during this period, including the forcing of moving our deceased from our grave houses and poles into graveyards. Regardless of the angel-like form, Haida beliefs are still present, entangled in the relief carving. Looking closely at the figure's human feet reveals bird claws directly on top, representing transformation from an earth being into a sky being, much like the creatures of the Haida world when presented mid-transformation. Our ancestors' resistance to the colonial other is evidenced by several examples of Haida art, such as the humorous buffoonery pipes that were made depicting some really interesting situations with Europeans and also of ourselves. But just as a naturalistic art was incorporated into Haida society to indicate high status and rank, I'm referring to Suuda's headdress, so too did it demonstrate our politics of refusal. A well-known story to some is that of 2 ridicule figures raised in Skidegate on top of 2 house posts, not a pole, but 2 house posts in the 1870s. It is said that a chief became intoxicated while in Victoria, British Columbia. He was fined and imprisoned for 6 months by Judge Pemberton of the Victoria Police Court. Upon returning home, the chief carved these 2 large-scale figures in imitative form, one of Pemberton and another of George Smith, Victoria's town clerk. He raised them, and villagers would walk by laughing at the shame of these men. Meanwhile, the men thought that they were being honored. Why, when we as Haida depict ourselves literally entangled in 2 worlds, do we not reveal the other in the same way? It is rare to find evidence of Europeans represented in classical Haida form, fully enmeshed in their new world and ours. There is a special example of a panel pipe located at the National Museum of Denmark where a European man is entangled with the beings of Haida Gwaii. Though he himself is represented naturalistically, he shares a tongue with a raven carved in classical form. And while facial features reminiscent of Haida forms such as eyelids, sockets, and brows can be found on some depictions of Europeans, most often they still read as European to me because their profiles are similar to that of other artistic renderings of the other, such as protruding foreheads and a sharp nose. This is the conundrum. Just as social function cannot be properly read without knowing its context as held in our oral histories, neither can the ambiguous compositions found in some curio carvings be simply decoded. Even in the depiction of roosters and chickens, which I believe, based on artworks I have found by our people, were actually very beloved by our people, probably because the birds, the domestication of the bird made access to eggs easy. They still maintain a European identity when brought into existence by Haida hands, as you can see on the top slide on the far right. Meanwhile, on the left, there is a mamajigai, or dragonfly, which is native to Haida Gwaii, and that is presented in classical Haida form. The lower pipe on the left-hand side shows a grasshopper, and you can see there's some European men as well on this panel pipe. I don't know what the figure is on the right. Now, there are no grasshoppers on Haida Gwaii, but they do exist on the northwest coast of British Columbia, of which we were there all the time. So I guess they were, considered very much part of our world. So why such delineation? Did our artists simply love the challenge of perfecting realism, or was it that the European subject matter was too foreign? Or was it because the other was too destructive to our way of life? The Gwaii legacy pole includes both Haida and our allies, all on the same level and form. The pole was raised in 2013 in Gwaii, which is located in the southern region of Haida Gwaii at Windy Bay, to commemorate the 25th year anniversary of the saving of Ll'nagaay Island and Greater Gwaii region from horrific logging practices, and to celebrate the subsequent groundbreaking Haida-Canada co-management agreement for the area, where 2 nations agreed to disagree on title and instead have come together to care for the area for future generations. This pole, carved by Jallaneden Shaw, assisted by his brother Gwaii, chronicles events related to the Ll'nagaay Island stand and the formation of the Gwaii Agreement, as well as the stories relevant to the greater Gwaii region from supernatural times through to today. Within it are 5 good people standing together, as you can see on the far right. These figures represent the people who stood on the line at Ll'nagaay Island and all the others who worked together to protect this special part of the world, meaning globally. All are presented in classical form, as is a visitor that peeks out of a dog's ear a little higher up the pole, in recognition of those who love Haida Gwaii and our people. Here the other has been brought into our realm, consciously or unconsciously, by the artist. Perhaps the result of disentangling all of ourselves in order to carefully weave out yet another new world. While the monumental act of the Llnagaay stand resulted in unparalleled examples of two worlds coexisting and has paved one of the paths forward towards reconciliation, we are not there yet. Our nation survived despite all odds. We have maintained control of our lives through the lowest points in history. But how can we survive the killing of that which makes us Haida, the lands, waters, and airways of Haida Gwaii? While Aboriginal rights and titles have been acknowledged in Canada's highest court of law and in its constitution, our future continues to be at risk from the impacts of industry, currently that of oil and gas. Just as Haida artists continue their commentary by employing classic form, they also continue their commentary through other artistic expressions and materials, asserting and maintaining our inherent rights and titles to Haida Gwaii. Gwaii Edenshaw's Hollow Promises presents a woman's likeness cast in cotton rag from the face of a high-ranking woman that is on the Two Brothers pole that he and his brother carved, and it stands in Jasper, British Columbia. Mounted on a half-oiled barrel, her face is torn and smeared with our beloved black and red colors. His artist statement reads, "A hollow, torn form smudged with greasy fingers, a worn soul under the heel of away from home. The price of money, we cannot bear it. The price of oil, we will not carry it." Created for the Haida Gwaii Museum's 2013 exhibition, Thanks But No Tanks, Edenshaw's commentary and his work speaks to the need not only to protect our lands and waters from devastation, but also to protect our girls from the social, physical, psychological, and spiritual exploitations of the oil and gas industry. Through Hollow Promises, Edenshaw brings to light the alarming rise in and manipulation of the sex trade that goes hand in hand with boom and bust resource-based economies and industries. Edenshaw lists the artwork's materials as 200 years of pain and exploitation, cotton rag, rust, and paint. Through this powerful piece, we are reminded of the future should we not disentangle and reconstruct even further. In speaking of our girls, it's important to recognize that my exploration of entanglement has been through what was historically the art of men. Today, it's more gendered all over the place. However, weaving in textiles, historically a female-gendered art, is also critical in surveying how we look at the self and the other, and deserves further exploration of the gender entanglements that exist. Spruce root weaving is one example. Most historical and contemporary spruce root weavings contain complex geometric designs representing rites, histories, lineages, and/or paying respect to the natural and supernatural worlds. These patterns are created through twining, skip stitching, incorporating dyed roots, or by utilizing grasses and sedges in a technique today referred to as false embroidery. There is also the practice of incorporating male-gendered art into these weavings, using crests and other figures, painting them onto the canvas of the woven spruce root. Roots are woven into pieces for both ceremonial and utilitarian use, such as ceremonial hats that you see here, and utilitarian containers and mats. With the introduction of iron pots and other materials, the weaving of functional work fell out of fashion. Later, oppressive regimes pushed social works out of the way. Just as the male curio emerged, so did the female curio. Created for both economy and surviving our oppressors, trade baskets and effigy weavings, emulating European wares and fashion, were created and collected. The use of false embroidery allowed weavers to incorporate text, just as argillite made room for documentation of words. Woven documentation continues today, as seen in the work of spruce root weaver April Churchill's Kunstagu story basket. In this work, she utilized natural and dyed spruce root and false embroidery to remember and recount a journey to another unparalleled agreement, the 2009 Kunstagu Kunstaya Reconciliation Protocol, the result of another stand taken against unsustainable logging practice in the northern half of Haida Gwaii. The protocol was negotiated between the Council of the Haida Nation and the British Columbia government to address Canada's misuse of Haida Gwaii. The negotiations leading to the agreement were intended to have been tripartite in nature, but as April states, the Government of Canada did not give their representatives the mandate to do so on the principle of title. In other words, Canada did not show up to the table. The design field at the very top of this basket, I guess I could just describe it. Oh yeah, it's right there. 2 dark bands encompassing a caramel-colored band represent the 3 different governments negotiating parties. As with the Gwaii legacy pole, we and the other are all represented in classical form, in this case through triple strand twining. No abstraction, no differentiation. Churchill records Canada's lack of participation simply by using a different color, the caramel one. This generous gesture of differentiating Canada solely by color as opposed to using a completely different material or technique or by leaving them out entirely is an integral reminder of the responsibility we have to each other, to all beings, to Haida Gwaii, to the earth. Everything depends on everything else. Whether messy or not, we are entangled. And so, by privileging Indigenous records of interactions with Euro-Americans through art and oral narratives, in this case that of the Haida, history is not challenged nor changed. And I hope in this short time a small drop of our shared history has been revealed. Hawa itkanusi, banga di gaga. Hawa Haida Gwaii, danga di gaga. At the langsting, the lang waluhan skaurigi gathu kiltla. Did I do it in an hour? Oh no, really? How quick did I go? Too quick? Okay. Nope. Been talking all day. Hawa. Yesterday, I sat with Aaron's class, and he said, "Yeah, you know, a 30-minute presentation. I got it down pat. It took me 50 minutes, so I spoke quicker today."
Hi, thank you very much. With regard to the basket and your discussion about how the artist uses material to be non-judgmental, inclusive in terms of the commentary about Canada's, I'm Canadian, so, you know, and non-participation in this particular settlement issue. Is there a meditative process on the part of the artist in the creation of this piece that you can talk about? So we're seeing the finished product, but what informs her experience of making it?
However, that. So first, I don't want to speak completely on behalf of April, right? She's the artist, but I will say that I don't know that it's non-judgmental. It's pointing out that Canada didn't show up, but that we're going to be respectful of ourselves and what we can achieve.
That's together. What I mean by non-judgmental.
Okay. I've got a little judgment, but she's the artist. There's an incredible story associated with this basket, which is in one of the books that I edited that's out of print, but we're going to reprint it next spring, and she tells an incredible story. But April's been involved with our Haida Nation government for decades, and she's been critical in moving our people and Canada forward. And the thought process that went into this basket is extraordinary. She's used roots gathered over decades from different areas of Haida Gwaii. That in itself shows the longevity, the complexity, the design fields that you see in this basket are incredibly thought out too in April. I'm so sorry if I get some of this incorrect. But essentially, when you do a design field, it has to be encompassed by another field. You've got you're keeping everything within a spirit. So when you read baskets, just like you read monumental poles, you actually read them from the bottom up. And so in this case, the first part that you see, it's kind of hard to see on the screen, or maybe it's me.
You know
But
what?
there-
I have a laser pointer. Do you want it?
Oh yeah, that'd be
Okay.
great.
I never
That'd be
be
very
that.
useful.
That and a credit card. You just press the, yeah.
Okay, how I love this. Okay, sorry. I got a real kick out of this. Okay, so, oh, yes, you see
I
this
know, right?
bottom, right? So, in it, you can just barely see these zigzags, and I apologize that I didn't make it clearer, even though it's a good image. Those are trees. So she's got commentary about the trees, you know, and the land, and then how you cannot remove the trees from the ocean, and vice versa. And this is a land use plan, and through our negotiations with BC, they refused at that time to go in beyond the high tide or low tide mark, or whatever differentiates them from Canada's government. Following that are two dark bands encompassing the blue and red designs you see, and those are cockles, and that's acknowledging the near shore. And then you've got the blue designs, which are waves, which bring our attention to the far shore, which again wasn't included in these negotiations, but is reminding us that you cannot not include them when you're making decisions. In the middle are strawberries, and that's the red, and then the little white and brown are, I believe, if I remember correctly, bear paws. Above the second band of cockles is spider web, and then you've got the three bands above that, and on either end, the very top of the basket and the very bottom as well, are the bands that encompass every story that's in there. So there was decades of meditation on creating this basket, and it was commissioned by someone in the provincial government who, you know, in working with us, it was pretty critical, that person, to bring BC to the table. And he asked her to tell this story.
Can you tell us which department that was, just out of my own personal curiosity?
I have no idea. Was it there?
I'm curious. Thank you. So she's, in effect, weaving a creation story, a contemporary creation story.
She's documenting history.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. Thank you very much for your presentation. You referenced oral history, and I'm wondering if you can tell me more about the presence of that in your work.
Sure, and I think I should first apologize for all the stuttering and weird words I'm using. I've been talking nonstop all day. Ask Laura, where's Laura? Where you are, right? Like from 10 till 3:30 nonstop, for different reasons of being here. So our written record is our art, right? And it's accompanied by the knowledge, and that's contained in our lives, in our minds, and it's passed down over generations. And it's a very strict process. You know, how I've talked is sharing. I'm not a trained oral historian by any stretch. So how the training would work is, you know, and we still do this today in the sense of how are we going to support our children? You know, where do they thrive? How can we support their gifts? How we can support where they need help? So in the old days, people would watch the children and observe who's got the sharp mind, the sharpest mind. And they would choose that child, and that child from about age 6 or 7, I think it was, would sit around the fire every night with the gray-haired men, the oral historians. And the oral historians would tell these stories that, again, begin from before human occupation on Earth. And some can last days, many, of course, last hours. And the child, or the apprentice, has to learn these stories word for word, inflection for inflection. And say you're 2 hours into telling your mentors this story and you make one wrong word, you stop for the night and you have to start again the next. So that's how our stories have been incredibly kept intact, even despite all of the upheaval I discussed here. The storytellers, there were different story towns that storytellers from across the islands would gather in to reconnect and reconfirm our collective histories and discuss our individual clan histories.
Thank you.
I have a question that's about the collection of the Haida Museum. I was struck by a number of the pieces that you showed us to illustrate the different kind of categories of entanglement come from the collection that you have at home. And can you talk to us a little bit about the history of that collection and where those materials came from? Did they always stay there? Did they go away? Did they come back? And talk to me about the kinds of range of materials that are there, because you didn't only show us the classic canonical pieces, but I'm struck by the fact that the Argillite plate, the American Eagle, and the text is there, and some of the other pieces. So can you talk a little bit about the sources of the collection and the ways in which you and other artists and historians use that as a repository for local history and what it means to have it at home as opposed to Aberdeen and other places around the world?
Do you have 4 hours? Okay, so thank you. This is a great thing for me to be able to respond to. It's one of my favorite things to say is that I believe one of the earliest, if not the earliest acts of what people commonly call reconciliation between the museum world and the Indigenous world in Canada was the formation of our museum, the Haida Museum. Society of our Haida Nation members and our Canadian friends who live on Haida came together in 1971, starting a society. By 1976, the museum was opened, and that's pretty incredible. Now, the thing is that with well over 95% of our people dying over the course of 40 or 60 years, a lot of things went even more haywire, and so you've got the oppression, and you've got things like the Indian Act, which included the potlatch ban, which outlawed our social, economic, legal systems. That's where all our business is conducted. So if you can't live your life the way you know how, and then the church and others are really shaming you and getting mad at you for wearing who you are, or practicing who you are, or misunderstanding, just general misunderstanding, thinking we worship totem poles. So then, even in Florence Davidson's day, she knew that they'd force people to cut them down. So I guess what I'm saying there is that there was certainly art made specifically for a commercial trade with Europeans. There was certainly free will of exchanging social function art for wares such as iron. I would say more so leading up to before the introduction of smallpox, which is the primary source of wiping us out. So post-smallpox, 1862, we got wiped out, and colonial regimes got really even more so. And the potlatch ban came into effect, and the church came, and essentially things were forcibly handed over. They were stolen, and a number, like 100, probably thousands actually. We know of over 12,000 treasures around the world attributed Haida, held in museums and institutions, and that's not including private individuals. And so there's all these records, and our museum friends, I really want to stress friends, even though I have to respond to the reality of the situation, have often said in the past, less so today, well, these things were sold. Here's the record. And I say, yeah, but there was a potlatch ban between 1884 and 1951, and extreme social and economic marginalization during that period, leading up to it and following it. These items were sold under duress. And I took a little contract law, so I think, we could make that point. But thankfully, we work on this stuff through relationships rather than court, and people, as we get to know each other, we come to accept and understand that. So yeah, probably over 95% of our, well over 95% of our belongings left the islands. And another way things were sold that would render it illegal is that with the church sort of flipping the way our society works, we're a matrilineal society, you follow your mother. And when the church came, they forced us into a patrilineal society. So then you've got people that are selling items that are not actually theirs to sell. So there's a lot of complexities there. Anyways, there was so little left in our community that people like Bill Reed and Robert Davidson and Evelyn Churchill, you know, they had to, and still do, travel the world like we do for our own reasons, studying these art forms because that's where the masterpieces are, that's where the unique pieces are. People had a few bracelets and little things like that and a couple boxes. So we didn't really have anything to open a museum with, if you think of it like that. So another thing I think what is worth celebrating, or at least really highly acknowledging, is that what I'm still thinking, and you nodded when I said this the other day, that possibly the earliest voluntary act of repatriation from a Western institution was led by then curator Peter McNair at the Royal British Columbia Museum, who somehow, I hear it's quite a miraculous and real action-packed story, managed to send home a number of monumental poles that had been taken from our islands in the early 20th century. And that is pretty spectacular. That we opened in 1976. We would have gotten the poles a little earlier. And as I like to point out, that wasn't something that was forced by policy or law. It was the act, the humanity of one person who wanted to come to our table. So since that time, you know, how we did begin with a collection, or we have a treasure house, so our treasures, was by the incredible generosity of Haida families and settler families on Haida Gwaii. Because when you think of how little was left in people's homes, and they willingly put these pieces, donated them to our museum, I mean, that in itself is, that's pretty good stuff. So that was how we began our collection, and then over the years it's really been through the generous and sensible actions, as my cousin Vince says, of our friends in the Western world that have, as individuals, said, this belongs at home. Or through long-term loans from institutions, or through acquiring funds through cultural properties to purchase items that might be leaving the country. So really, we actually haven't had a physical, like a material culture repatriation since then, to the best of my knowledge, around our collections. But what we did do in the mid-1990s, it was a calling that my dear friend Lucy Bell had to bring home the remains of our ancestors from museums around the world. And so 20 years later, we have brought home the remains of over 500 of ancestors from about 10 institutions and a number of private individuals. And I need you to know this. The last private individual who contacted us was a young anthropologist who had just finished her degree. And her mother, and bless her mother's soul, she, you know, we have to understand some people aren't, you know, they're not, nothing's been revealed. So they don't know necessarily. I'm not saying it's okay, but I'm just saying they don't know. So this mother goes out, she's at a garage sale. This is in 2003, and there's a Haida skull for sale. So she bought it for her daughter to celebrate her daughter graduating her degree. But her daughter is a new generation of which some of history has been revealed, and she called us up right away. So those are the types of things that happen. And I do want to acknowledge, though, that we're currently working with UBC, University of British Columbia Museum of Anthropology, to bring home a grave post, a mortuary pole, as well as the Museum of Vancouver for a mortuary pole and a house frontal pole and a number of what I call ancestral belongings or long ago belongings, which is commonly called artifacts. So we've got these active things happening, and that is because of the work that we've been mandated to do by our nation, our Haida Repatriation Committee. So this work of building relationships and bringing home our ancestors isn't my work; it's the work of our nation, and we all do it together. I'm just one person in this complex web, and they've mandated our Haida Repatriation Committee to do this work. With the support of the museum and administration of the museum, with the goal of mutual respect and cooperation and trust. So that means we, no matter what our emotions are, we have to interact with dignity for each other and with the intent of relationship building. And because we need to move forward together. We need to understand the past. We need to repair the past. We need to heal together. We need the Western world to find their grief instead of being a little scared about learning about history. And that's how we move forward together. So, our museum and our heritage center, one of my favorite things to say, is they're not institutions. They are part of the institution that makes up Haida society, greater Canadian society, and I would go as far as saying global society. Our museum's mandate is Haida Gwaii. Our vision is to inspire understanding and respect for all that Haida Gwaii is. But really, our mandate is global because of the cultural diaspora, right? Our lives are contained in these institutions around the world. So as we embark on now bringing home some of our treasures and belongings from these institutions, it's going to be a little easier because of these 20 years of relationship making and reparation. I'll point out at this point, too, that 20 years and 500 ancestors later cost us $1 million or more in cash, sweat labor, and donations. That is because we have to follow our Haida laws, our Haida protocols, as well as the music. We have to respect each other, but there are just things that we have to do. And so outside of the sort of Western typical costs that there would be, there are a lot more. Each ancestor gets their own grave box. Our children make button blankets to wrap our ancestors in before they're put in the boxes. And you buy a box, you're looking at a minimum $500 for a small one, and these are bigger ones, and blah, blah, blah. This is a good point to bring up the American Museum of Natural History, who's a very, very dear friend of ours. We began our relationship in 2002 when we brought home the remains of 48 ancestors. And the poor museum didn't know what hit them because 25 or 28 of us showed up on their doorstep. I mean, they knew we were coming. And there's a lot of backstory there that I won't share here, but it started out tense. It was never awful. We know there's work to be done, and on both sides, right? But it wasn't, like it is now, where I have dear friends and stuff. It was a little tense, and the thing is that we involve the people we're working with in our journey. So they're involved in the ceremonies, the food burnings. Yes, we actually had one here, and they're involved in experiencing the unbelievable, turbulent emotions that come out in looking at our belongings, which is what I was doing today. And they share in our grief, and as I said, they find their own. And what began with someone who I consider a good friend now, she's no longer at the museum, saying, well, I don't even, why are you here? Like, we could have just sent them home. They're just bones, right? By the end of it, through this inclusion, the only part we don't do is have them in the room when we're preparing them. We have a feast afterwards. we'd asked to have a feast, and there was no space in the museum. And we hadn't given, to be fair, we hadn't given a lot of time for that, right? And then, oh, we don't know where we can actually have a feast, because that's our legal way, right, of accepting what's going on and bringing our ancestors home. And so that was also poo-pooed. So by the end of it, this lovely lady, oh God, is this being live streamed? I don't know if okay, well, I'm going to say it anyways. We all smuggled food into the halls of the anthropology department and had a feast. She arranged for it, and the volunteers made about 40 origami butterflies, because that's what we use to symbolize our work, which we call yakudangan, to pay respect, as opposed to repatriation, because repatriation is integral to honoring our ancestors and healing, but it involves so much more. So anyways, we had a grand old time. They decorated the formaldehyde, smelling halls. We ate all our food. Anyways, the next morning, it was about 5 in the morning, and our big delegation is waiting outside on the sidewalk for the big bus to come get us. And of course, the bus had to stop first to pick up our ancestors, which were in big totes, ready to be flown home. We'd already said our goodbyes to everyone. We weren't expecting anyone, but when the bus pulled up, my friend came out of the bus at 5 in the morning, and she was wearing a little vest we'd given her. And I said, "What are you doing here? We said goodbye last night." I thought, oh, she just wants to say goodbye again. And she said, I couldn't let them come over here by themselves. So that is how transformative this work is for everyone, and this type of work allows for Western and mainstream museums to be voluntary agents of change rather than the physical evidence of Canada and United States genocides against First Peoples. So anyways, that's a bit about our museum, which you can't separate from our nation. And then the range of materials we have in there is very expansive. It was almost another talk, sorry. It was another talk.
Time for one question.
Okay. I'm a docent at the Museum of Natural History, and I work in that hall. And currently the hall is closed for renovations. Are you involved in any work on the redoing of that hall? Because it's going to be closed up probably for at least 2 years.
Yes.
So they just told us that since we're just peons and volunteers there, that they're going to keep it closed for that time, and they're going to redo the whole hall. And I know from working in that hall, there were things in there that just didn't belong there. Okay, Franz Boas went up north, and Mr. Hunt, who was with him, I think they bought everything in sight and brought it back. So would you comment on that, please?
Certainly, Howard, for that question. So, as I mentioned, we know of well over 12,000 of our belongings. Some of them would have been for commercial trade or willingly handed over, but the majority would not have been. Our ongoing consultations, which we will have to revisit, but I can't see them changing, is we don't have room for 12,000 of our belongings, and that there is value, this is what our elders have said, to having some of these pieces out in the world, because A, there's Haidas that live all over the world, but B, these ancestral belongings and new contemporary works serve really well as ambassadors for our nation. And I think also to educate about how we're here and we can all work together. What they have directed us to do is bring home the full spectrum of our material culture. Excellent examples, so from the most utilitarian to the highest ceremonial, all mortuaries, materials, of course. and things like that. And that what we do choose to leave out in the world, we have to have the self-determination over what it is and how it's presented. And we're doing that with this museum. We have a long-standing relationship with them. I really want to give another shout-out this time to Peter Whiteley, curator of the ethnography, Pacific ethnography. I call him the Raven of New York because, you know, where we're from, our islands, I said this the other day, one of my friends said, we're so remote, we don't know what we're not supposed to do, so we do it anyways, right? Peter, on the other hand, lives within the confines of bureaucracy and rules and regulations that are harder to not be a part of, and yet he's found some amazing ways to join with us in a really beautiful journey. And yes, I am involved in the redo of the hall, and it's been a pretty spectacular journey so far, and I get the pleasure of working with Laura as well and others. I don't ever want to give off the idea that things are perfect and dust your hands off. That is absolutely not the case. But the friendships that we have made are deep and long-standing, and I think, you know, that's important in succession planning too, that if a curator or whomever has a really strong relationship with someone of Indigenous ancestry who's also working, like another curator, right? But a Western one, an Indigenous one, that these are just like the way we live, it's intergenerational, and you have a responsibility to the next generation, so you need to know each other. So in succession planning, there needs to be that overlap and that involvement to ensure this keeps going forward, so we don't have to keep knocking on doors.
So in the spirit of such sociability, I wish I could invite you to feast, but I can at least invite you to nosh and to share a drink. And before we open the doors, I'd like you to join me in thanking Nika Collison for being here.